skip out of here as quickly as possible. I have a flight that leaves in an hour and 45 minutes from Baer, and I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to run. And I told Reverend Elder Nancy that the only thing I like less is a guy who comes late, leaves early, and gives a speech, and I'm really sorry to be that guy today. Over the last few years, I've come to know a number of MCC members who are not only part of a community of faith, but also part of a movement for social justice and human rights here in the United States and around the world. And I found myself over the last few weeks, whenever I mentioned this event, figuring out new ways to explain MCC's place in the diverse array of religious orders and churches that have started in America. I explained that I had come to know MCC through my work at the State Department on the human rights of LGBT persons, and that MCC leadership had been actively engaged in fostering a conversation about how best to make progress on that front. I explained that the church had been founded more than 40 years ago and had emerged as a welcoming place for the LGBT community and for others who were left out or unwelcome elsewhere. I noted, as others had noted to me, that MCC sometimes is known as the church that welcomes the marginalized. But it was only last weekend, as I sat down to write, that I thought to take a look at the mission and core tenets of the MCC. I read the mission: to tear down walls and build up hope in responding to injustice in the world. And I read the 6-point philosophy, which you all should know by heart, so I won't repeat it here. And I learned that you have a philosophy that puts human rights at the center. Human rights work is not easy, but it is the foundation for a harmonious world in which each person can, as my old boss used to say, live up to his or her God-given potential. So while MCC may be known as a church that reaches out to the marginalized, the human rights advocacy you've committed to do is not on the margins. It goes right to the heart of what is needed to build a just and peaceful world. I've been asked to talk today about the challenges to securing human rights protections for LGBT persons around the world, and I'm going to get to that. But first I want to take a moment to reflect on context. I think it is difficult for people today, particularly those of us who are lucky enough to live in rights-respecting democracies, to appreciate the tremendous historical importance of, and the arguably unprecedented success of, the political project of recognizing international human rights. Yes. Eleanor Roosevelt led the charge at the United Nations in the late 1940s to seize the moment of opportunity to channel the world's horror at the tragedies of World War II and focus on recognizing certain moral truths that were universal. She made a singular contribution to international politics and to the project of bringing about lasting peace on earth. Her work then was premised on the truth that we are, as the Universal Declaration puts it, born free and equal in dignity and rights. And the recognition that, as President Obama would declare in Oslo 6 decades later, only a just peace based on the inherent rights and dignity of every individual can be truly lasting. Yes. I want to say a bit more about what I mean when I say that human rights has been a successful political project. Just because human rights are a true description of the obligations of governments and the rights of individuals doesn't mean that they have purchase on the way the world is run or the way that individuals experience their lives. Being true is the right place to start, but it isn't enough. In order to have human rights affect policies and practices of governance, human rights have to become part of how we think about governance. They have to become part of how we diagnose and talk about problems facing people, how we strategize about fixing them, and how we measure success. And they have to become part of the laws by which power and authority are administered and restrained. As Americans, we have a powerful example in our national history. Our own political project of building a country and a nation was grounded in an articulation of principles that found their echoes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights more than a century and a half later. And our project of becoming a more perfect union has been made possible and sustained by a politics that draws upon, refers back to, and is defined by a commitment to a set of principles about the rights of individuals. No step forward in our shared political project has been an accident. Each step forward has come because we have mustered the strength to attain a better representation of the principles recognized at our founding. We know that today work remains. We know from our history that progress is not linear. Last week we were reminded of this by the one step back on Tuesday, followed by 2 steps forward on Wednesday. But the story of America has been one of principles as destiny, and it will continue to be that way for as long as we as a people continue to work for that more perfect union. Now, looking around the world today, from the unconscionable bloodshed in Syria, the prison camps of North Korea, the ongoing torture and disappearances in Iran, to the persistent lack of democracy and denial of fundamental freedoms in China, Cuba, and Vietnam, to the victims of sexual and gender-based violence in the eastern Congo, where people have suffered decades of conflict, to crackdowns on NGOs and independent media in Egypt, Russia, Ecuador, Azerbaijan, and elsewhere, it might seem strange to say that Eleanor Roosevelt and the colleagues she worked with from a host of other governments have been successful. There are many hundreds of millions of people who are living lives without the ability to exercise their human rights and fundamental freedoms. So it should be clear that when I say that the political project of human rights has been successful, I don't mean that the work is over or that human rights are now secure around the world. But when you think about the fact that it's been less than 70 years since universal human rights were first formally recognized by the international community, and that today there exists a range of international legal instruments and documents that articulate the obligations of states, when you think that a number of countries have incorporated aspects of international human rights law into domestic law, when you think that many countries have created institutions charged with monitoring human rights domestically, when you think that the international community has, both through the UN and a number of regional institutions, come to recognize that human rights are central to maintaining peace and security, when you think that the language of human rights is routinely used to assess government failures and to defend the work of activists and advocates making the case for change, when you think that even governments that routinely violate human rights often make attempts to defend themselves using the language of human rights, thereby implicitly conceding the legitimacy of the basis for claims against them. And when you think that there are now a number of courts at the domestic and international level that have prosecuted people guilty of human rights violations and abuses, when you think about the policy conversations about a range of global challenges from economic development to human trafficking to gender equality that now inevitably include human rights. And after all this, when you think about the fact that when my own father was born, at the beginning of 1948, just 2 generations ago, none of these or any of the many other ways in which human rights has become part of how the world thinks, interacts, justifies actions, none of these was real. It is clear that we have come a long, long way in a short amount of time. And the reason I say all of this is because when I tell people I work on human rights for the US government, sometimes people say, wow, that must be so depressing. And while it is true that human rights violations and the denial of human dignity that they entail are indeed too widespread, too frequent, and too devastatingly sad to describe fully, it is also true that the possibility for progress is undeniably there. Yes. Eleanor Roosevelt and the many others who have come after her have bequeathed us a living project and the potential to have a lasting positive impact on the world. Human rights are the world's long-term strategy. And so I'm not depressed to be the human rights guy. I feel lucky and humbled to be part of a constellation of actors in countries around the world, most of whom make time for human rights work after long hours in a factory or taking care of children or both, who are making the case, often at great personal risk, in town halls and in courtrooms and in churches, on blogs and op-ed pages, in parliaments and justice ministries for the kinds of changes that will bring about a world that more fully embraces the dignity of every person. I feel lucky to be part of a common project with all of them. The only thing I'm depressed about is not having enough time in the day. I also feel fortunate to be working for the United States government. Throughout Democratic and Republican administrations, our leaders have understood that the United States must play a leadership role in advancing human rights around the world. That means, among other things, supporting those advocates and activists on the front lines, speaking out about human rights violations and abuses, embracing the fact that universal principles apply to everyone, including ourselves, and that, as former President Clinton has said, the power of our example is more powerful than the example of our power. Human rights leadership also means calling attention to gaps, to those who have been left out or marginalized in the past, and to working to make good on the promise that human rights are the birthright of every person. This is some of the hardest work, because most often those who have been marginalized, the most vulnerable people in societies, aren't marginalized by accident. They're marginalized on purpose. And popular opinion among dominant groups often supports discrimination and stigma. Whether you're talking about protecting members of religious minorities or a minority ethnic group, women or LGBT persons, it's not just the building up of protections and laws and institutions that is needed, it's often the countering of public perception that these individuals count less or are less deserving of universal human rights. Reinforcing the universality of human rights protections, that you can't pick and choose who gets them and still call them universal. For the Obama administration's efforts to advance human rights protections for LGBT people as part of our broader human rights foreign policy. And while of course this effort is relevant to LGBT persons around the world, it's also a continuation of a long tradition of American leadership on human rights, of being a voice for the voiceless. As President Reagan, you didn't think I was going to quote him. As President Reagan said more than 25 years ago, the violation of human rights, whether in Kampuchea or Paraguay, Afghanistan or North Korea, or the murder of Baha'is in Iran, is the rightful cause of all free people. Yes. Today, that's our job, our duty. America must continue to be a beacon of hope, sending this message to the oppressed of all nations. Those who suffer for freedom are not alone. We think of them and we are with them. Yes. Let me take a few minutes to talk about some of the key challenges to protecting human rights for LGBT people around the world, and then say a little bit more about what we're doing to work with others to respond to them. The conversation has to start with the horrifying prevalence of violence, sadly, also of killings of LGBT persons, because of who they are and who they love. As we've been reminded by recent news coverage of hate crimes motivated by animus towards LGBT persons in New York and elsewhere in the US, this is a problem we have here at home, too. And around the world, thousands of individuals are victims of violent attacks based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. In some countries, governments have taken the first step toward finding solutions by tracking these acts of violence and reporting on them. But in many more, there are no reliable statistics, only far too frequent reports of individual incidents. Trans people are often at heightened risk. The Trans Murder Monitoring Project documented the killings, often in brutal fashion, of 265 trans people around the world in the 12 months ending in November 2012. In addition to violence, bad laws continue to rob LGBT persons of the protections to which they are entitled. Over 70 countries still criminalize consensual sexual conduct between adults of the same sex. Many of the leaders of these countries defend these laws, saying they are necessary to protect against the importation of homosexuality, which they depict as a Western invention. There's a peculiar irony to this, since the majority of these laws are relics of colonialism that are left on the books. Others defend these laws by pointing out the fact that they are rarely enforced. But this overlooks the fact that the threat of enforcement leaves LGBT persons, and indeed anyone who could be accused of being gay, vulnerable to blackmail and exploitation and afraid to reach out to authorities when they are victims of crime. And furthermore, even when they are not enforced, laws are signposts to citizens. They have a teaching effect because they reflect a country's public values. Laws that criminalize people for who they are send a message to the population writ large that these people are worthy of stigma and discrimination and create the kind of environment where violence is more likely to be tolerated. In addition to bad old laws, we're now seeing a rash of bad new laws. Broadly speaking, these laws target LGBT persons by curbing freedom of expression or freedom of association and peaceful assembly. Some come under the heading of criminalizing gay propaganda and making it illegal to talk about and therefore to advocate for greater acceptance of LGBT persons. Russia recently adopted a version of such a law. Others limit the freedom of association and assembly by barring NGOs that work on LGBT issues or banning pride marches. These laws run counter to universal human rights, and they impair the rights not only of LGBT people, but of all people in the countries in which they've been put in place. A third set of challenges has to do with the tools to push back against violence, discrimination, and unjust laws. Civil society is increasingly under threat around the world. More than 50 countries have passed new laws aimed at restricting the activities of civil society organizations in the last 5 years alone. In many cases, entrenched regimes that have accorded power to a corrupt few are taking aim at critics and trying to silence voices of citizens who would hold them accountable. Organizations that work on protecting LGBT people are often even more imperiled, and their members more likely to be subject to violations of their fundamental freedoms. Moreover, in places where there is an overriding societal discrimination, LGBT groups are often ostracized by others in civil society. In addition to these challenges, and of course deeply connected to them, is the challenge of getting good facts to highlight the problems that LGBT persons face and to advocate for the remedies that are necessary. One of civil society's greatest tools in holding governments accountable is documenting violations and abuses and engaging in public advocacy for remedies. Advocates also need to be able to share facts that counter some common myths that are propagated by those who wish to reinforce stigma and discrimination. Myths like the ridiculous notion that sexual orientation is contagious, or that people can be recruited to be gay. These scare tactics are best countered with the scientific research that shows them to be nothing more than lies perpetuated by hate. Of course, the problems I've highlighted today, violence and bad laws and challenges for human rights defenders, are interrelated, and the United States, at the direction of President Obama and Secretary Kerry, is working to address them in a variety of ways around the world. Ambassadors and their teams at embassies and consulates around the world are having tough conversations with host governments, making clear our concerns about human rights violations and abuses when they occur, and encouraging leaders to stand on the side of universal human rights, even when it's unpopular. We talk to government ministers and presidents, to police chiefs and mayors, and we point out that protections of human rights mean protections for everyone. No excuses, no exceptions. And our foreign assistance professionals and diplomats spend a lot of time meeting with civil society actors in their host countries, getting to know them, the challenges they face, so that we can support them in the most effective ways possible. We're using our relationships to build bridges between local civil society and government representatives. For example, in one country in sub-Saharan Africa, our ambassador introduced local LGBT advocates to the country's top police official and facilitated their first interaction and discussion, which to everyone's surprise was positive. As a result, the local LGBT organization now has a direct communication line to the police should they need to reach out, and they often do. We also publicly support LGBT persons and organizations. Our embassies and consulates around the world host International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia and Pride events. Our ambassadors march in pride parades, write op-eds, and make public statements advocating for the human rights of LGBT individuals. Already this year, we've seen events and celebrations in every region of the world. Our ambassador to the Czech Republic and his family opened their home in honor of Idaho, bringing together local LGBT leaders to join in a discussion over dinner with U.S. LGBT leaders. Our ambassador to the Philippines joined acclaimed television personality and LGBT advocate Boy Abunda in creating an It Gets Better video to take a stand against all forms of bullying. In Tel Aviv, the ambassador and approximately 50 embassy staff members marched in the city's Pride Parade along with members of the Canadian, Dutch, Spanish, British, and French embassies. The group wore t-shirts with Pride printed in English, Hebrew, and Arabic on it. In some places, our embassies serve as safe spaces for LGBT individuals and activists to come together and discuss common challenges and strategize about solutions. Embassy Port-au-Prince in Haiti hosted its first Idaho event this year, a screening and discussion of the documentary film Les Hommes et Dieu of Men and Gods, which explores issues of homosexuality, religion, culture, discrimination, and acceptance in Haitian society. More than 100 people attended from LGBT advocacy organizations and the diplomatic community. And in Rwanda, members of LGBT community groups, the diplomatic corps, local non-government organizations, and several senior Rwandan government officials attended an Idaho reception at the U.S. Embassy. We've also worked in the multilateral system at the UN and in regional organizations to reinforce the fact that human rights are the entitlement of LGBT persons just as they are the entitlement of any other person, and that governments must uphold their international human rights obligations. We supported South Africa's resolution at the Human Rights Council 2 years ago that was the first ever UN resolution to recognize, as former Secretary Clinton put it, that gay rights are human rights and human rights. We supported the creation of a special rapporteur in the Organization of American States who can monitor abuses and offer expert advice in this hemisphere. And we support the calls from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Navi Pillay earlier this year for the UN to institutionalize its work on human rights for LGBT persons, including through regular reporting. We have invested in supporting NGOs and activists who are working to make the case for change in the societies in which they live. We've reached out to other governments, including Norway, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Finland, and to private sector actors to help support the Global Equality Fund. And we're putting resources to work in 25 countries around the world through grants to civil society organizations that will help them build their capacity, work together, leverage strategic litigation and advocacy campaigns, and document and report on human rights abuses. With this support, we're also able to fund new innovative initiatives to protect transgender persons from violence, as well as educate and train judges on international human rights obligations as they relate to LGBT individuals, with the hope that their decisions enhance protections and advance equality. Our embassies and consulates play a critical role. Through their contacts with civil society, we are able to channel resources to emerging local organizations in remote corners of the world. In one project, we're assisting a local group to formally register as an organization. Sounds simple, but it's crucially important so that they can do things like open their own bank account. In another project, we're providing funds for an emergency shelter for LGBT individuals who are rejected by their community. We review many, many more strong applications than we can support ourselves. Hence, our hope is to grow the fund with the help of like-minded corporations, foundations, and governments. As part of the fund, we've also created a special emergency initiative with international NGOs from around the world so that when an advocate gets in trouble, and they often do, we can throw them a lifeline of support, whether that means paying for a doctor or a lawyer or helping them relocate temporarily to get out of harm's way.